are you all? I'm Adam. I'm a carriage driver here in Colonial Williamsburg. I've been working for the foundation since I was a little child, but today it's not going to be about that. It's going to be about the barn and how it runs. So we're going to show you a little bit of what we have here, tell you a little bit about the ins, the outs of carriage driving and kind of what goes with all of that, some of the driver training, the horses being trained as well, and kind of a little bit of the background history and how we got to where we are today. So hopefully you all don't mind. I always tell everybody, I don't know it all. I'm not an expert, so if you ask me something and I don't know, I'll just say, I don't know. But first thing that I like to talk about is how this barn came to be and how the foundation acquired some of our vehicles. So in 1929, the foundation purchased our first vehicle for $500. And when that vehicle was purchased, it was about 3 years later that we purchased another vehicle. And that was our red carriage, or what some people know as the Mulberry Phaeton. And that vehicle was purchased and then restored. And then about 1942, we actually started giving carriage rides on the daily. And those carriage rides took place every day as long as the weather was permitting for 50 cents a carriage ride. So, of course, it's a little bit different today, but 50 cents for a carriage ride. And today our collection is around anywhere between about 8 to 11 or 12 vehicles that we have. Including some of the ox carts, some of our training vehicles, also some of the riding chairs, and even some of our newer carriages that are still under construction today. But over here, I've got what's known as our governor's carriage. This is the Royal Governor's Coach, and the Royal Governor's Carriage right here was built around 2005 in Vienna, Austria, paid for by the Gorman family. It's one of our traveling coaches or traveling carriages. And the term carriage or coach you'll oftentimes find is going to be interchangeable in the 18th century. But if you look at this vehicle here, you'll see where the driver sits on the box, or what we would call the box seat or the perch. And then you'll see behind us is the actual portion of the vehicle where you all actually sit. And if you kind of look at the vehicle, you'll notice there's some places for windows to be kept, so your windows would go here. You also have the ability to have lanterns placed as well, a roof rack, or what some people may call an emporium. And then, of course, the age-old question that everybody asks when they ride in the governor's carriage is, how in the world do I get in it? So we're not going to make you jump, but these little brass doorknobs right here that were actually cast in the Getty foundry are going to open up to our steps here. And our steps are going to roll down. And as they fold down, you step on up into your carriage. And there's some seating in there for you. You also have a footman's box that's on the rear. So if you were going to be doing any extended travel and you had a footman or a groom or a hostler that was going to be traveling with you, that's where they would stand. So not the most comfortable, but not intended to be comfortable. So the individuals that are going to be riding in the vehicle here, it's going to be individuals of the upper class. So that's where you want the comfort there, actually inside of the vehicle itself. Not so much for the driver or the individuals on the back of the vehicle here. And this is one of, I believe we've got 3 vehicles that are hooded, actually 4 vehicles that are hooded. And this vehicle, it does go out almost 3-4 times a week when we are in our peak season. Right now, we haven't been using the vehicle. But a really, really cool vehicle, one of my favorite vehicles to drive. And why so? Because of the ability for this to turn, and also for the ability of this vehicle to kind of maneuver in different places. And I'll show you exactly what I mean, and I'll also kind of answer the question of, are these vehicles heavy or not? Because everybody always wants to know, are the horses really doing any serious labor, and just how heavy the vehicles are. So I'm going to fold these steps up. And I'm going to move to the front of that carriage there. And unlike a lot of American vehicles today, or American equine vehicles, you'll typically see what's known as a yoke that the horses or the animals are going to be attached to. For this vehicle, we have a pole that actually is going to run right through here, and that's where that will be attached. And as that pole is attached, we have just a locking mechanism that will lock that pole into place with. And then we'll attach the horses to the swindle trees. And sometimes, if you're on a different vehicle, they'll have roller bolts, so we'll attach them there. But the cool thing about it, once that pole is there, there's really no need for the animal to be there to balance the pole, unlike a yoke. So that's a really cool feature. But I'm going to show you just how light this vehicle is. So this vehicle, where we'll move it from, is actually the wheels. I actually have to unchalk really fast. So we'll unchalk that. and we're going to push the vehicle forward for you. And if you notice, I'm not going to put a lot of effort into the vehicle. A little kid could actually do this. So we're going to move that vehicle just like that, and it rolls. It moves on its own. So it's an extremely light vehicle, and you see that I was able to stop it with one hand, and it's able to push back. And I can use that same hand, that light movement of pushing that vehicle back as well. And why those vehicles were built, like this is because in the 18th century they understood that the horses were going to be used for a labor. So you didn't want the horse to have to lug something around that was incredibly, incredibly heavy. And over here, you can actually see where we have two of our horses being put to, as we would call that. So essentially that's us hitching the vehicle or putting the vehicle together, putting the horses to the vehicle. And you'll notice that where you've got Lauren at the front and Lily at the front, they're connecting what are known as the pole straps, which the horses will have connected to their collar. You'll see the reins are already connected there. And Lily, on the opposite side, is putting her traces through. That's what's going to allow the horse to be able to step into the collar and push, which will then pull that vehicle with them. And if you look, you'll notice these guys don't seem very big. That's about the size of the horses in the 18th century. They weren't meant to be these incredibly big animals like Clydesdales and Percherons and Shires. So most of our horses in the 18th century typically range in height from about 15 hands to about 15'2". Anything that was bigger than that was usually, whoa, that's a big horse. And so one of the cool things about these vehicles here, we've got the ability to also oftentimes put interchangeable poles or pole heads on the vehicle, and that's how we're able to drive multiple teams of horses. So what she's driving is known as a pair of horses. So you start off with a single, one horse. Then you have what's known as a tandem, where it's one horse in front of the other, more of an agrarian style, which eventually gets into the steeplechasing because you would use that as you're warming up the horse as he's ready to run his race. So it's an easy, soft way to exercise the horse. And then you have a pair, which is side by side. And then from that pair goes to a unicorn or a random or three abreast, and then to eventually the gentleman style of driving, which is known as a four in hand, where you have four reins, manipulated in one hand, typically the left hand, which will serve as your right hand, or your anchor, and then your right hand, which essentially assists that left hand. And by driving a team of horses, essentially if you've got the four horses, the wheeler horses closest to the wheel, that's where your power is going to come from. Your steering is also going to come from there. Typically they're your more larger horses because they've got to actually push the vehicle and hold it back. And the leaders that are oftentimes in front, those horses are essentially your flash, your dash. They're known for looking good. They're going to be the first thing that people see. And oftentimes those horses are never doing any work unless the vehicle is going uphill, and that's when they'll go into draft. And we don't do too much of it here, but if you kind of remember about 3-4 years ago, we would take some of our fours out and drive around. We escorted the Williamsburg Duke of Gloucester in the four as well. And you notice that vehicle that's setting off, that's our newest vehicle. That vehicle there, that's the Madison Carriage. That came to us from Pennsylvania, from some of our Amish friends at Double E Carriages. So that's what we would call a light sociable. So a sociable is a more public vehicle that's going to be used for you to really engage and socialize in. Typically not a roofed vehicle. Generally, a sociable will have two seats, or bench seats as it's referred, where the seats will face one another. So if you're having a conversation, you're able to look at the individuals while you're enjoying your ride. And then you'll notice that some of the vehicles will have hoods on those on the tops. And each hood is going to be a little bit differently. On a chariot, which is typically known as a half vehicle, so you would take a full carriage or a full coach and essentially cut that in half or right down the middle. It's got a half roof, or what some people call a half hood. And then on a full vehicle, like a landau, which is right here, where Queen Elizabeth, when she came here in 2007, that's the vehicle that she rode in. And you'll notice that has a hood that can retract, open, or close. And also one of the cool things about it, it comes down from both sides. So if you were sitting on one side and you wanted the hood over top of you, you could sit there and have the hood still remain up, or you could drop that hood and get a little sunshine on your head. And then if the weather got inclement, the cool thing about that vehicle is that you could pop the hood up, and it doesn't take any longer than about 2 minutes for that hood to go up. And the other cool thing about this vehicle here, it's actually bulletproof. So that vehicle there is actually one of our heavier vehicles, which I always like to brag about, because most people look at this stage wagon here, which is essentially an early form of public transportation. They look at that and they go, ooh, man, that looks like it's a heavy vehicle. It's actually not as heavy as people think. This thing right here gives a lot of our horses a run for our money because of that Kevlar lining that you see there. But I know right now everybody's probably like, yeah, carriage is carriage. A carriage has wheels and that's it. These things don't move on their own. So I think right now what I'll do is I'll introduce you all to two of our horses, if that's fine with you. So what I'll do is I'll introduce our director right here, Mr. Jeter. So this is Andre Jeter. So some of you all have probably seen his smiling face driving through Williamsburg. And you probably remember that most recent article that just came out with Mr. Andre in there in the Trending Traditions, as I call him, Idris Elba's twin brother. But this gentleman right here, he's our director. He's standing with Duke. And Duke is one of our Gelderlanders. So these two guys came to us about 4 years ago. So they're a breed that originates with some European influence. They're known for coaching and kind of being used as a little bit of everything. And then this is Duke's driving mate, and they're not brothers. They are the same breed. That's why they look so familiar, but not brothers. And this is Dan right here. So Duke, I believe, is an 11-year-old, and Dan, I want to say, is a 7-year-old. And right now they're going to stomp because they've got the flies, but that's okay. If you were to look at these guys today, these are much, much larger than what your horses would have looked like in the 18th century. And the one thing that I always like to talk about these guys is their action. They're very up when they move, so it looks very presentable as they're driving up and down the town. It gets a lot of people to say, ooh, I want to ride with those horses. So oftentimes it's not the carriage that gets the attention, it's the horses, whether it's the color, the way they're moving, and the way that they're being driven by the driver. And a lot of how they move is going to be influenced and based off of their training and also that driver training. These guys are very forward going, so the more you allow them to kind of have some breathing room, they almost float when they jog up and down the street. And actually, if you wanted them to go slower, we actually jog them because they've got a great big walk. And Lauren right over here, you've probably seen Lauren right now as we're going through our lambing season and we've got some of the cattle that are out and about. Lauren is also an expert driver, a lot better than me. But Lauren drives a little bit of everything. She's our tandem driver, four-in-hand. She'll do it all. But Lauren's standing with Dan right here. And if you look at these two guys, you can kind of see that there's some differences in the size on them. Duke is a little bit more slim, more lean. Dan's a little bit more girthier of an animal. And the breed, as they start to change and develop with their work, that's why the breed will change, almost like a German Shepherd. So 100 years ago, a German Shepherd looked totally different. But now the work, the demand, and what we use the dog for has changed. So now how we breed the animal has changed. And the same with horses. You start getting bigger and more heavier animals as you start doing more heavier loads. So a lot of the brewery days, so when they're hauling the big freights of beer from coast to coast and going up and down regions and competing with the surreys and the ferries, you need a much heavier animal. And when you don't use a heavier animal, what essentially they'll do is they'll use 6 or 8 horses. So that's where you get more to the hitch style of driving, which actually these guys started out driving before they came here. So they were actually part of a 6-horse team. They were what were known as the swing horses. They were in the middle. So you have those leaders, the swing horses, and then what are called your wheelers. If they were driving an 8-hitch, you would have what are known as body horses that are also in there. But these two guys, remarkable horses. When they first got here, they were only here for 3 days, and we actually used them in the College of Women Mary's homecoming parade. They had the fife and drum in front of them. They had the dragon going over top of their heads. They had the marching band to the side, and these guys fell asleep. So they're worth their weight in gold because up and down Williamsburg streets, we're always going to encounter several different things, whether it's the fife and drum, muskets being fired at the armory, whether it's plastic bags being blown, or anything that can startle a horse. And these guys are just always gentlemen. So it's cool to have horses that are that big, that are that sensible, because there's a lot of power within these horses. So these guys are roughly about 1,400 pounds apiece. I'm only about 147 pounds soaking wet with change in my pocket. So if they got into a fix where they decided to pull, it's 2 of them and only 1 of me. So I'm not going to win that battle. But Andre right here, who is our director, we've actually got 2 horses that we acquired about a little over a month and a half ago, Ladrini and Colton, and we're probably going to pull those guys out and show you as well, show you the differences in between the sizing of the 2 horses. But that's a little bit of Duke and Dan right there. You get to say hello to Andre, hello to Lauren. So they're thebomb.com. And that's all I got about them. I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about shoeing as they go get the other horses and show you what the shoes are like that we have here. So as they turn out, you get to hear the best sound besides the fife and drum. So I love hearing the hooves. But shoeing is kind of one of our things that gets asked all the time. So what I've got here for you are some different shoes. So in the horses that are shoed here in town or shod in town, they're shod for different reasons, just like us protecting our feet. So we put shoes on, stylistically today where, hey, I want to wear the newest Jordan or the new Nike, but this is more for function. And what I mean, if you look at this shoe right here, you'll notice that this shoe has a pad on it right here. And that pad right there is a gel pad, almost like us having a Skechers or a Dr. Scholl. And this is a front shoe that you'll notice on. And that pad right there is used because some of our horses, they aren't the best movers, and sometimes they will land on what we call the forehand, so they're heavy and load-bearing there on the front of the animal, not necessarily putting the 50-50 where it should be. So we'll put a pad there, and that pad is going to help protect and cushion the animal. And it doesn't matter if you're at a trot or if you're at a walk. You can have horses that will acquire and require pads. And the one cool thing about these shoes is that about every 6 weeks, we have a farrier that's coming here, and he'll replace these. So he's able to replace the shoe, he's able to replace the pad. And there are differences in between a horse's feet. So like our fingernail, the keratin that it's made out of, it's the same material that a horse's hoof is made out of, except where our fingernail will grow out, a horse's hoof will grow down. So everything that's being removed is the dead stuff, what they're going to naturally wear down if they were in the wild. But once you start to take these animals out of, wild situations and you put them in a domestic environment, things do have to change. And so the shoeing, becomes a big factor. And also the terrain, that's going to play a big part of how you shoe, why you shoe. And just like a baby or a child or infant who may need corrective shoes because they may be pigeon-toed or knock-kneed, horses are the exact same. So we have corrective shoeing that can go a long way. And one of the biggest improvements in shoeing today, most people never even think about it, but I think it's really, really cool. It's actually the iPhone and the X-ray. And why the iPhone, any farrier or yourself or your smartphone, you can actually video how that horse is going to walk off or trot off, and he can see how the horse is landing, how he's carrying, and where's the point of breakover. And then the X-ray actually gives us a picture of where we think the toe is or think the heel is. It shows us just how much more room that we have, or you can remove the toe or lift the heels to better help that animal as he travels and does his work. So that's a little bit about some of our shoeing. We do have a master farrier. His name is Andrew Morales. So if you ever get the opportunity to kind of check him out, he is worth his weight in gold, and the horses appreciate him dearly. But the last thing I'll kind of say about the shoes, because everybody likes to always ask this question, is does it hurt? And how I answer that question is it can. And what I mean by that is if you have somebody who shorts a horse or quicks him or doesn't put the nail exactly where it needs to be, going past what's known as the white line, like if we look at our fingernail, if you cut past that, that's where you get to that sensitive tissue, and sometimes you'll notice that it'll bleed. It's the same thing for a horse. But someone who's been doing it, who pays attention, a horse that will stand and not be all over the place, it's relatively rare that you see farriers, who nipping or quicking horses or making those big drastic mistakes. But I don't want to say that it doesn't happen because I'd be lying. But just like with anything, people get better with time and repetition. So I'm sure farriers, if you talk to them of how they were when they first started out, they'd probably say, oh my gosh, I was horrendous. But they learned, they've progressed. And it's the same with us. Sometimes we cut our fingernails too far back, but you know what? We allow it the time to grow in, and we remember it and say, I'm not doing that again. And just like with me driving, when I first started driving, I was god-awful. And I'm glad you don't, have any footage of that right now. But it was terrible. But I'll show you two of our newer horses. These are Dutch harness horses, a much lighter style of Dutch harness horse. These guys are flash and dash, as I like to call them. They're very pronounced in how they move and their movement, a very athletic breed of horse. The first one that's going to come out, this is Colton right here. And these guys right here, you'll notice almost immediately, how the hoof fall sounds, much lighter, when they put their feet on the ground, but also a much lighter build as well. So Colton is being handled by Mr. Jeter, and then you have Ladrini, who's on the opposite side, being handled by Lauren. These two guys are curious. If you look at him, you can see how Ladrini's got his ears forward. You can see that he's looking around and he's sniffing. Because like anybody, they don't have the ability to reach out and touch. So a lot of times it's their smell. They're using their eyes, their nose. That's how they're going to gauge the situations. But the cool thing about how these guys are standing right now, if you look at their ears, you can oftentimes kind of be cued in of where their eye is located. So their eyes can actually move independently, which is really cool. Because these are grazing animals, or what we would call prey animals, they've got to always be on guard and watching out for things that may approach them from the rear. Coyotes, mountain lions, and things of that nature. The other thing about these guys, they've got a remarkably wide range of vision, but their depth perception isn't that good. So when we sometimes get people who ask us about why do we have blinders on the horses, it's for some of those very reasons. So when you are going up or down Duke of Gloucester Street or Nicholson Street, sometimes you may have something that may come out, like in Halloween, the guy who was dressed as a Tyrannosaurus Rex. He walked out to my left, a horse saw it, didn't like it. I was able to move him and kind of change that direction. But fortunately, because that blinder was there, he was able to then refocus, and I was able to rechannel that horse's energy and not focus on what he thought was going to be scaring him. And you do have several different types or styles of blinders, blinkers, or winkers. They're cup blinkers, hatchet blinkers, D blinkers, all based on different jobs and also what's going to be best for that animal. Because some horses, will have preferences just like people. And then you also will find that with carriage horses or coach horses, it's going to be a closer fit. Not a tight fit, but a much closer fit. Still going to give the animal room that if he wants to turn his head or neck, he can turn and look and see what's behind him or to the side. But what's that used for is as that animal is traveling down the road at a trot, whereas a loose blinker is going to flap and hit and bang that animal on the face, that closed blinker pretty much just sits right there. So that's the cool thing about the blinkers. It also gives me the ability, if I have to touch a horse with my whip, I can touch that horse that's on the left-hand side or the right side, and that other horse never even worries about it or sees it. So that's really cool. And these guys, if you look at them, you'll notice, as Colton likes to nibble, it's still a young horse, but these guys, the more they work, the work is what sets the horse. The old saying was 50 miles a day would keep a horse out of bad ways. And that's because the jokers would work and work and work and work, and when they got back, they were happy to stand still. And one of the things that we found is that as we work these guys and then give them time off, they ache to go back to work because they're social. And the other thing is they get bored. You can go and look at some of the pastures, and you'll notice on the trees, you'll see where they've started to chew on the trees or where they start to paw at the ground. It's because boredom starts to set in. So it's like a slow day at work for us. If we're busy and we're moving, from 10 o'clock until 4:30, it's a breeze. But when it's slow, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm pulling teeth. You can stick a pencil in my ear. But these two guys right here, they should be on the street hopefully in the coming months. And then we'll have another pair that'll be coming as well, another much smaller, or not much smaller, but similar in height to these guys. And we'll put them out on the carriages as well. And hopefully, eventually, we'll end up putting these guys in tandems and unicorns and letting them go for a little bit of some driving around the town in a different configuration. And it gives people a different education and also a different way of seeing, the different driving styles. But if you just look one more time at these guys before they kind of walk away, you'll notice that these guys have a nice and short coat that's on these guys. That's the benefit of them being blanketed. And sometimes people ask us, why it is that we clip our horses or why we'll keep some of the blankets on the horses. And it can be a hot topic depending on who you ask. But like I like to say, it's not the cold weather that's going to set that winter coat in to grow. It's the reduction of light. So that reduction of sunlight is going to cause that winter coat to grow. So when we blanket our horses or we keep the lights on all year round, what that does, it helps us because in Virginia, as you all know, if you sit 40 minutes, you'll get all 4 seasons. Sometimes you can have it where it's 80 degrees in the middle of January. And if that horse has all that winter coat on him, it's like me or you trying to go run a mile with a sweater on. It's uncomfortable. So when we shave some of our horses, you'll notice like Buckshot, Mike, and Sergeant, Frito, and Alex, we have different styles of clipping that we'll clip these guys to. And one of the more common styles that people have come to be associated with since about 2015 here is actually our trace clip, which it gets its name because it traces along the animal's body. Then you have what's known as a chaser clip, which you'll see buckshot and lancer, how they've been clipped. It's a little bit of an easier clip, runs from the stifle up the neckline. And then you have what are known as bib clips or strip clips or saddle and blanket clips, all of them for a different purpose. And it's mainly to help keep that animal comfortable. It's a humane thing to be able to do for the animal. In an ideal world, hey, if we could keep them, short-coated all year round, I don't have to groom them and get hair in my mouth, that's what I go for. But, of course, Mother Nature doesn't oftentimes work with you, so you have to work with what you're given. And you will get people who asked, oh, was that a thing in the 18th century? We don't start to see that documented until about 1812. It becomes really popular amongst the Hackney individuals in Europe. And then once you start getting into the early 1900s, you start to see horses being kept in tight quarters with oil lamps on all year round for that very reason. So that's always a good question that I like to kind of talk about. And when horses were clipped in the early 1820s and so on, a lot of times they were actually clipped with a razor. So I think that's really, really cool. Talk about the steady hands you need there. Today we're not doing it with a razor. We just have electric clippers. We can plug them into the wall or the battery-powered ones, which helps us out. But enough of me talking, so I'm sure y'all probably have some questions that you'd like to ask. So we can wave to Ladrini and Colton, tell them see you later, see you around. And thank you to Andre and Lauren right there. But, yeah, if there's questions, I'll answer them.
Thanks so much, Adam. Several questions. Tammy and Kay were both curious about how tall 18th century carriage horses would have been.
That's a good question. So the height will vary, but not greatly. So typically you see most of your carriage horses are usually right around about 15 hands. And then you do have some that are registered from some of our ads and descriptions of horses that are upwards of 16 hands, but usually the common factor that you see in Virginia, because it is going to vary from colony to colony, and also the work, what people are going to be able to use the animal before, and then also, of course, like today, how cheap or how convenient is that animal going to be. But the typical, what I've seen is generally right around 15 hands, about 15.2-ish.
Thank you. So Heidi was curious about how long it took to train a team of horses, and what is that process like?
Yeah, so that's another cool question. A lot of that is actually set up and kind of your director and how we pair the horses with individuals, because not every pair of horses are going to get along with every driver, and not every driver is going to get along with every pair of horses. So you have to look at, number one, the individual's confidence. And you have to look at the individual of the horse that you have there. So both of those horses may have different confidence levels. And then you have to look at what it is that they're going to be doing on the daily. So if they're going to be driving all the time, we probably don't want to put them out on the street first thing. So we usually start them off with about a 90-day program, a driver in that pair of horses. And that way we can get them behind the scenes, get them used to seeing things that may scare the animal or provoke them to maybe want to do a fight or flight response, but also be able to teach the driver and educate them about the vehicle, how to manipulate their reins, and also things to look for. Because just like driving your car, you've got to always be looking ahead of you. You may take a glance down at the dashboard or in your car, but you're focused on the road and what's going to be coming up next. And it's very similar to that with those carriage horses. Right now, you've probably, I don't know if you've been here to Colonial Williamsburg, but I've been driving a pair of Cleveland Bays, Lancer and Buckshot right now, for 2 years. And they're not exactly the A-plus students, as they'll say. They give me a good C. They show up to class. But I've been driving them for 2 years, and we've been making steady progress slowly. And I always answer the question that every day that you go out and you drive with the horses is a training day, because there's always going to be something else that you're going to encounter. There's always going to be something different. So I say a typical, just to get you going, almost like getting your learner's permit. It's usually about 90 days. And then anywhere between about 2 to 3 years to get confident in just driving and understanding what it is that you're going to encounter. And then, like with driving your car, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, the more you're going to learn to look for and understand, like when you hear a wheel start to creak or if something needs oiled. So I would say about 90 days getting you going, and then about 2, maybe 3 years after that to be comfortable with it.
Arden is curious if you could tell us maybe, how long would you have to train today before you're able to go around town with visitors?
So today, it's typically we like to give 90 days in that aspect. Of course, some people can pick it up quicker than others. Myself, it took me way longer. I was a super duper slow learner, and I'm not afraid to admit it. It took me close to almost a year to get it. And part of that was because how I learned. So I had to relearn bad habits and then kind of learn the right stuff. But typically today, we usually see that most of our drivers, we like to keep them on a 90-day program to get them going. And that's them going out with our director. And then we have a head coachman that's here. And then we'll sometimes send them out if we feel that they've got, the confidence and the skill level to go out with another driver. And that way it gives them just, a different variation of kind of things to do. But we like to make sure whoever we're sending them out with, they all do the same principle in the foundation. Because when you get too much thrown at them, that's when you get a lot of things that kind of start to get confusing. So typically 90 days is what we like to stick to before we send them out. So it's nobody, I can say right now, that's in the barn today or prior that I know of has come here and been able to drive, the first day and get it right. And I can tell you for sure, I wasn't one of them. So it took me 6 months to kind of be able to drive in a straight line and not hit a curb.
How about in the 18th century for a carriage driver or a coachman? Is there a sort of a formal training process? Do we know much about that?
So there's mention of drivers kind of being apprentice, and then you have individuals, because most of your drivers were typically enslaved individuals, where you'll see boys or stable boys kind of being groomed up underneath hostlers or drivers. And I don't have any information on how long that typically was. But for instance, with Jefferson, he has a young gentleman by the name of Michael that's on his property. And we see that he's mentioned as a stable boy at the age of 14. And by about 19 years of age, he's then listed as a driver. So in that respect, we could say that it was around 5 years. But I don't know if that's because the need changed. The gentleman who was driving prior may have been sold, died, could have been harmed in an incident, or just may no longer be needed as a driver and may have another skill, as we oftentimes see, and they'll go and be a shoemaker, or they'll go and work in like saddle shops because they've got the familiarity with horses, harness, and such.
Angelique is curious about the differences between driving 2 and 4 horses. Are there different temperaments the horses would have? Like you want to have these 2 up front? Or
oh man,
this
is my stuff right here. Yeah. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but no, this is cool. So that's a great question. So I like driving the 4s in tandems, and a lot of times I'll tell you exactly my first encounter with driving a 4 because it was god awful. But you do have to have, you want your most forward-going horses in the lead of that team. Because, of course, number one, if they're forward-going, you don't have to worry about trying to take a whip and encourage that horse forward, and you don't have to worry about a horse ignoring you if you're giving him, hey, come on, and he's kind of telling you, I don't really care about it. But what you'll find is that typically you're going to put your leaders in the lead of that team who are the most forward-going, usually the prettier horses. And then you'll oftentimes find that your power isn't going to be in the lead of that team because you don't want that pulling your wheelers off of their feet, and you don't want that pulling you off the box seat. So generally you'll have your soft, easygoing, very forward horses to the front, really a good, sensible mouth, and you kind of will counterbalance your power. So if you've got a strong horse to your left, you're going to put a strong horse to your right-hand side, and that's going to help you when it comes to making your turns. So that way that horse isn't cutting in or diving in on you, but also it's going to make that turn much smoother and prettier. And then your wheeler horses are typically going to be a much taller animal, usually have a little bit more size to them. Some people prefer a bigger rear end or a bigger butt on the horse. But I've noticed that if you get a good wheeler, and it doesn't matter if he's got a good butt or a good shoulder, it's just if he's got a good mind on him. He's got to be willing to hold it back and bring the carriage forward with him. Driving a tandem's a little bit more of a trick because when you're driving a tandem, essentially where you've got one horse in front of the other, you've got 2 turning points, or what we'll call pivot points. So essentially your leader, if he gets cute, he can turn around and come back to you. And that's when you got to have a really, really good hand, but you also have to be not afraid to use your whip as a driving tool, not lashing out and trying to beat the animal, but encourage him to, hey, let's go back around this way. Because if he's going straight and that tandem's going straight, it's fun to drive. If your tandem's not going straight and they become a pair and they're side by side, that gets miserable really, really quickly. But that's a really good question. And I always say this too, you've got to make sure that when you put a four together, you've got to make sure your wheelers and your leaders are both conditioned, because if you get somebody who starts getting out of shape or falling out of rhythm, they're going to become the animal that's getting drug along. Or if your leaders get really to the point where they get lazy, your wheelers start to run into each other. So that makes a little bit of a not successful drive.
So you'd mentioned, the difficulty in going uphill, but Jan was curious about what about going downhill? How do the horses and the drivers handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these guys here, they're in what are called full collars. So they have all of their shoulder and all of their rear end to be able to use as they're going up or downhill. The other thing, it's a lot of driver accountability and rein management. So we have reins that are set up based off an Achenbach driving system, or Edwin Howlett is the other gentleman that we use a lot of our references from, and how you shorten or lengthen your reins. So if we're going downhill, the old expression is always that the driver is going to be the one who sweats, because you're holding the horses back. You're aiding the horse to help hold them back. As you go uphill, the horses are going to be the ones that are going to start to sweat because you're pushing them forward. Here in Williamsburg, we don't have any real serious hills, so it's not like in Pennsylvania where you go up and down some of those Dutch streets. But the other thing is the rhythm. So if you get your horses in a nice rhythm, when they approach that hill, when you start giving a half halt and shortening the horses or shortening your reins, you start setting the horse up as he prepares to go down the hill. It's much like us with a wheelbarrow. If you know you're going uphill, we kind of set down a little bit, and then we start to push forward. And going back, you'll see us where we kind of raise that real wheelbarrow, and we'll start coming down the hill. And the other thing, too, you'll notice that in the pole, if the driver is, shortening the horses the way he should be, you'll see that pole's going to raise just a little bit, just like a wheelbarrow's hand will, and that's going to help to be able to take some of the weight and the load for the horses as well. We don't have any of our horses in breast collars right now. We're not using any of the old breast collar harness because, one, it wasn't very good, and two, it restricts some of the movement of the horses. There's a big difference between your breast collar harness and full collar harness. Full collar is essentially what goes around here is essentially going to be a one size that will fit one horse. A breast collar harness, you've got the ability to go up or down and resize that harness, so you could use that on multiple horses. A lot of people do like to use it. I'm not opposed to using it, but I really like to use something that's going to benefit the horse and myself. And I've noticed that the full collars, the horses don't come up with nearly as many sores, and they're usually much more willing to go forward as well.
So you talked about whip, you talked about reins, and all of the things connected to the horses. Susie was curious if there were specific verbal commands that you use.
So for me, I'm absolutely kind of by the book when it comes to if I need a horse to, kind of come back to me. A lot of people kind of are always taken back when they hear it, but I use it and I do it really nice and kind of steady. And then when I need a horse to walk on, I'll tell them walk on. So if we're leaving from, let's say from a standstill, I'll tell them to walk on. And if I need them to trot up, I just tell them trot up. So I don't really do the G's and the ha's. I know some people that do, and I have a friend that actually she tells her horses right or left. But for me, I'm much more of, if I need them to trot, I tell them trot on. I don't yell it at them like trot on or anything like that, because the way you communicate with the horse is what type of reaction you're going to get. So I usually say trot on, and I might give them a long, slow kiss when I say it. And if I have a horse that's kind of late to the party, as we say, let's say, for instance, like Lancer and Buckshot. Sometimes Lancer's like, I'll think about it. I'll call his name first, and then I'll call Buckshot. So that way Lancer kind of has like a little bit of a head start, but not much, because I want the carriage to kind of move very smoothly when they take off. I don't want it to be like somebody just learning how to drive a stick shift and you're jerking back and forth. But I use brrr if I need them to slow down, whoa as well, but walk on, trot on, or walk up.
Elena was curious if there were any carriages being built in Williamsburg, and maybe you could speak to that today, but then also in the 18th century.
Yeah, so in the 18th century, we do have carriage makers and builders that are here. You also have inventories of individuals who have passed and vehicles being put up on auctions and being sold with estates. So you do find that. And we have our carriage makers and wheelwrights that we use. So our carriage makers who built some of our more recent vehicles, we've actually got a company, or an Amish company, that's in, where are they, Burdenham, PA? Yeah, Burdenham, PA. It's Double E Carriages. So they actually built the Madison for us, and they are building us another carriage right now, which hopefully that's going to end up being named after our first coachman that we have on record, Mr. Spraggins. And that's going to be here in a short amount of time. But the 18th century wise, Mr. Adam Canaday, we know of his shop building carriages and making chairs. And then we also have some cart makers. Carts typically two-wheeled vehicles. So you'll find that you have cart makers. And in Yorktown and Richmond, where you've got a little bit bigger population, you see a little bit more carriage makers and wheelwrights there, especially with the vehicular traffic. And today, our wheelwrights, they do a lot of our wheel maintenance for us and have made some of our wheels for us and some of our small body carts, and like the ox wagon that we use as well. But, of course, today we're in a museum setting, so a lot of times those guys, we limit the work that they can do, not because they can't do it, but because they've got to also interpret. So a lot of the times, they're talking about the same thing over and over and over. So they usually don't get, a fair share to do, the amount of work that they would have been able to do in the 18th century and keep up in that aspect. So we do have carriage makers that are still around today, but it's not as many because, of course, most of us are driving Volkswagen, Ford, and things of that nature.
Tell us a little bit about carriage drivers, coachmen in the 18th century. Who were they likely to be? Were these Afro-Virginians? Were they white Virginians, enslaved, free?
So typically we see that your carriage drivers in the 18th century are generally enslaved individuals. We do have references of individuals that were indentured servants and of European descent, but generally you see that the individual is generally of an enslaved man or young boy. That's here. I don't see any references of any women being enslaved and driving vehicles. Typically, it's almost always a man. And generally, that individual falls under the category of a hostler or a stable hand or a groom, and kind of almost a jack of all trades, because your drivers are essentially your veterinarian, your farrier. When they're carrying a spares kit with them, if something were to go wrong and you're out in the middle of nowhere, he's got to be able to come up with a quick fix and a quick solution. So these are talented individuals, and oftentimes they'll usually, when you do see them sold, unfortunately, because they are sold like any other piece of property, the property value for them, because they have that added skill with horses and reinsmanship and harness and vehicles, they usually are able to fetch a much higher price, which also leads to a lot of your drivers from historical records running away. So we see quite a few drivers that actually run. There's two that are in the city of Williamsburg that actually run, and we see runaway ads taken out for them here in Williamsburg and also King and Queen County. But generally, most of your drivers are generally enslaved men, but not uncommon to see someone of a European or Irish ancestry.
I think we have time for one final question today. Jenny was curious if you would consider yourself more of a horseman who became a historian or a historian who got into horses, and maybe you could tell us about how you sort of came into this yourself.
All right, that's a cool question. So I'll just tell the truth, because that's always better than making up a lie. I liked horses from a distance. It wasn't my thing. My uncles have had horses. I've had cousins that have had horses, but it wasn't my thing. I liked the way they looked. But outside of that, that was fine. They made a mess. I didn't like getting my nails dirty, like up underneath there, because I always thought that was nasty when you went to go wash your hands and eat, and it's dirt and junk there. But what made me change my opinion was actually my senior year in high school. There was a girl that I thought was actually like the best thing since the barbecue. So that's what made me kind of fall in love with horses really fast, because I figured if I lied to her and told her, yeah, I know how to ride horses, that would get her attention, but it didn't. But eventually, after me kind of taking a couple riding lessons after that, I kind of got curious, and the curious nature kind of started to sit in. And my mom actually had a picture of some of our former carriage drivers, like Mr. Joe Jones, Mr. Shepard, and Mr. Willie Minkins, and Willie Fitz. And so I saw that, and I thought, man, that's really cool, because they look like me. And I noticed that, the barn had kind of changed, how it looked in the presentation. And I thought that would be really cool to kind of bring a little bit of that back. And also because a lot of the times people are really, really nervous to approach, folks that, work with animals, because there is a reputation that's out there of them being, kind of like that. But I got into it, and then one thing led to another. I started driving here in 2013. I didn't get good until 2017 when we got Mr. Bennett, who's a world-renowned driver, came as a director for us. And he kind of took me under his wing because I almost killed him my first day. So we went out and we drove, and literally we went down towards the golf course, the green golf course, and it was going good, and then it wasn't going good. And he was really, really polite about it. He was like, all right, we got some work to do. If you're going to, let me help you, we'll help you. And I just became a sponge and soaked it up. So that's how I got into it, and hopefully I'll continue to drive and, add to my experience and maybe eventually train a few others. So,
Thank you so much, Adam. I know a lot of people watching today really appreciate your taking the time and sharing your knowledge and your passion and showing off the beautiful carriages and horses that we have here. This program was made possible by a generous grant from Ferguson Enterprises. We are grateful to all of our donors for their contributions. To learn how you can support programs like this, please follow the link pinned to the comments below or join us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Adam, why don't you give us the final thoughts? Take us home.
So if I've got anything to say, keep coming. We want you here. You keep me employed when you come, so I definitely want to see you. The other thing is that, get into some driving. It's really, really cool. Once you drive, you'll never want to ride again is what I always say. But no, when you come, I'd love to see you. I'd love to chit-chat with you. America's favorite coachman, a.k.a. your carriage driver's favorite carriage driver. But no, seriously, come, be safe, enjoy yourself, and let's bring carriage driving back.